Today, we are zeroing in on a fundamental challenge in the intensive care unit and the emergency department. How we select and implement analgesia for the critically ill. Why is rigorous pain control non-negotiable for anyone who is critically ill?
It really comes down to physiology. Pain in the ICU is, it's just everywhere. It's constant.
From procedures, I imagine.
Exactly. Procedures like endobronchial suctioning, chest tube insertion, even just vascular cannulation. And when that pain is uncontrolled, it triggers a massive sympathetic nervous system response.
And that response is destructive.
It is. It drives up the heart rate, elevates blood pressure, and it dramatically increases myocardial oxygen demand. For a patient who is already compromised, that can push them into ischemia.
And for the ventilated patient?
For them, pain means anxiety. It means fighting the ventilator. That leads to ventilator synchrony, and the big fear is always self-extubation.
The stakes couldn't be higher, which explains why the whole management paradigm has shifted. So what is the modern approach to initial management now?
The standard today is analgesia first. Sometimes it's called analgosedation.
Right.
The goal is simple. You treat the pain first before you even think about reaching for heavy sedatives. If you treat the primary driver of the distress, which is the pain, you often find you need significantly less sedation overall.
What's the clinical payoff of that approach? I mean, in real terms.
It's significant. Using an analgesia-first model is proven to reduce total opioid requirements. This, in turn, minimizes complications like delirium, it avoids that prolonged deep sedation, and it can reduce the duration of mechanical ventilation.
It's a win all around.
Yeah.
For safety, for recovery speed.
Absolutely.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. Let's move from strategy to pharmacology. If you're looking for the ideal critical care analgesic, what are the three non-negotiable qualities?
Well, we look for three things. First, it has to deliver effective pain relief with minimal negative side effects. Obvious, but important.
And second?
It must maintain hemodynamic stability. Many of our patients are so fragile, we just cannot afford a massive drop in blood pressure.
Okay, and the third?
And this is essential in the ICU setting. It must avoid accumulating. We need agents that don't build up in the body, especially in patients with organ dysfunction, which is, let's be honest, most of them.
Organ failure is the rule, not the exception.
Right.
So before we jump into the drugs themselves, let's talk strategy. Why must we always use multimodal strategies, even when opioids are still the cornerstone?
Because a multimodal approach is about efficacy and risk mitigation. Opioids are, they're indispensable. They suppress the cough reflex, the respiratory drive, which actually helps with ventilator synchrony.
But they come with huge risks.
Of course. Tolerance, dependence, withdrawal, all the things we worry about with prolonged use. So by adding non-opioid adjuncts, paracetamol, regional blocks, we attack pain from different angles.
The different pathways.
Exactly. And that synergistic effect lets us reduce the total opioid dose needed to get the job done. That dose reduction directly mitigates the risks.
Excellent. Let's get right into the agents then, starting with the classic, morphine. What are the standard dosing ranges, and what's the critical warning we all need to remember?
Morphine is potent. A standard intravenous bolus is 5 to 10 milligrams. The infusion rate then typically runs from 1 to 5 milligrams per hour.
And the warning?
The warning is all about the kidney. Morphine is metabolized into active compounds, mainly morphine-6-glucuronide.
Which is excreted by the kidneys.
Exclusively. So if you have renal impairment or outright renal failure, this active metabolite accumulates. And that leads to this profound, delayed, and very prolonged sedation. You have to adjust the dose dramatically or just switch agents.
That complexity really forces our hand. Which brings us to fentanyl. We often reach for it when we need hemodynamic stability. What are its doses and its major risk with prolonged use?
Right. Fentanyl is the go-to for cardiovascular stability. The standard bolus is 50 to 100 micrograms. The infusion is commonly started at 1 to 5 micrograms per kilogram per hour.
And the risk?
The risk is its lipophilicity. It loves fat tissue. So while its initial effect is rapid, the major issue is redistribution and accumulation. Meaning, if you run a fentanyl infusion for days, the drug saturates all the peripheral fat stores. When you stop the infusion, it doesn't just stop. The drug slowly leaks back out of that tissue. This means a significant delay in recovery, potentially keeping the patient on the ventilator longer.
So it starts fast, but can finish incredibly slow. Okay. That brings us to alfentanil. It's often described as context-sensitive. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. Alfentanil is very fast-acting. It begins with a 5 milligram bolus, and that's followed by an infusion of 2 to 5 milligrams per hour.
And the context-sensitive part?
Initially, it has a shorter duration of action than fentanyl, which is appealing. But just like fentanyl, if you run those infusions for an extended period, say more than 12 hours, you get context-sensitive prolongation.
The longer you run it, the longer it takes to wear off.
Yeah, actually. It becomes unpredictable for long-term use in the ICU.
So, morphine needs renal adjustment. Fentanyl and alfentanil both accumulate over time. This has to bring us to remifentanil, which is often called structurally superior for long-term infusion. Why is that?
Remifentanil is, well, it's the ideal choice when predictability is what you need above all else. Its infusion rate is typically 1 to 10 micrograms per kilogram per hour, and its onset is incredibly rapid, less than 60 seconds.
But the real magic is the metabolism.
That's the key. It's metabolized by nonspecific plasma and tissue esterase enzymes. This whole process is completely independent of the liver or the kidneys.
Which is a massive clinical advantage. What does that mean for its half-life?
It means it has a consistently short half-life of only 2 to 3 minutes. It doesn't matter how long the infusion's been running.
2 to 3 minutes.
Always. You can run remifentanil for weeks, and the moment you shut it off, you know exactly when its effects will be gone. That's critical for doing neurological assessments or daily sedation interruptions.
That control is invaluable.
Okay, let's shift to the non-opioid side. Starting with paracetamol or acetaminophen, what's its primary role here?
Paracetamol is a foundational adjunct. Its main role is delivering morphine-sparing analgesia and also, very importantly, providing antipyresis.
So it reduces the total opioid dose?
It does. Studies show it can reduce the opioid dose needed by 20 to 30%. But we have to be clear. It has limited standalone power for severe acute pain. It's there to smooth the edges, not manage a major trauma by itself.
Right. So if paracetamol is the safe baseline, what about the riskier adjuncts? I'm thinking of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs and tramadol. What's the restriction there?
The use of those agents must be highly selective. I mean, routine use is explicitly advised against. You have to be extremely cautious.
Why is that? What are the big risks?
We're mainly concerned with 3 things. Gastrointestinal bleeding, which can be catastrophic, acute kidney injury, especially in septic patients, and platelet dysfunction. So if you use them, it has to be short-term with very, very close monitoring. Avoiding systemic toxicity is often the best path. So beyond systemic meds, what about high-impact regional techniques, especially for post-op pain?
Regional techniques are fantastic. They give you massive pain relief without the systemic side effects. You're talking about things like epidural, intrapleural, or specialized nerve blocks like the transversus abdominis plane block.
And these use local anesthetics.
Yes, continuous infusions of local anesthetic right at the site of the injury or surgery. They dramatically reduce how much systemic opioid you need. And even something as simple as local infiltration before vascular cannulation can make a huge difference.
Okay, so we've picked our agents, we have a multimodal strategy. How do we properly assess pain in patients who often can't tell us they're hurting?
The assessment has to be standardized and regular. Healthcare providers need to adopt validated pain scales that don't rely on the patient talking.
What are the main tools?
The 2 primary examples are the Critical Care Pain Observation Tool, CPOT, and the Behavioral Pain Scale, or BPS.
And what do they measure?
They assess observable behaviors, things like facial expression, body posture, muscle tension, and how the patient is interacting with the ventilator. Regular assessment using these scales is the only way to accurately titrate your drugs.
It's the only way to get objective data on a subjective experience. Finally, let's talk implementation. What key protocols do we need to prevent complications like tolerance and dependence?
The critical strategy is protocolized weaning. This involves daily interruptions of the analgesic and sedative medications. Some people call them sedation holidays.
The daily wake-up.
Exactly. You try to wake the patient up every day, assess their neurological status, and reduce the medication dose. This prevents tolerance from building up, and it helps you find the lowest effective dose for that patient.
And what about non-drug approaches?
We have to remember those. Non-pharmacologic adjuncts are so important. Things like music therapy, massage, guided imagery. They don't replace the drugs, but they support the overall effort. They make the drugs more effective at lower doses.
So, to summarize the key takeaways, analgesia first is the definitive standard of care. Always use multimodal regimens to leverage synergy and reduce that total opioid load.
And critically precise knowledge of each agent's dosing and metabolism is directly linked to patient safety. You have to remember, remifentanil's consistent 2 to 3 minute half-life gives you control. And you have to remember the risk of morphine's active metabolite accumulating in renal failure. Understanding these details is what separates adequate care from excellent care.
We know that things like music therapy and massage can support patient comfort. So given this big push for data-driven protocols, how effectively can we actually quantify the therapeutic power of those non-pharmacologic efforts? How can we make sure they get integrated and prioritized in every ICU protocol? That's certainly something to continue exploring.